Okay, I promised I'd be back to help, and here I am. Classwork 8.5. I'm going to do two sample problems, but this is page 555, 11 through 31, and 59 odd. We're going to be doing number 13 and 31, two of which I think are slightly different than the two I did on the homework, and so that's why I wanted to go through them with you today. So number 13 says that we are trying to find angle Q. So we're trying to find angle Q. And so if we notice, we have a situation of side, side, side. I do not know any combination of angle and side at all, so I cannot use the law of sines. So we're going to be using the law of cosines here. Because again, side, 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 or side, angle, side is when you use the law of cosines. So let's just write that out to review. Law of cosines is c squared equals the other two sides, a squared plus b squared, times 2 times those two sides, times cosine c. With the whole idea that I'm either looking for this side or this angle. And if we notice, I have all the sides. So that means I'm going to fill in the a, b, and c, and I'm going to leave this as what I need to find. So then the last thing to consider in terms of the setup, before we be careful with the arithmetic, is if I'm looking for this, if I'm looking for a particular angle, I need to start with the corresponding side. Again, don't worry about, because look, there's no a, b, and c here. So we're not worried about a, b, and c. We want to think in terms of if I'm looking for a particular angle, which we are, I need to start with the side that corresponds. So that's the key setup. If I'm looking for angle Q, I'm going to start with 7 because these are the two that correspond to each other. And then A and B really doesn't matter which one is A and B. They're just simply, these are, I refer to these as the other two angles. All right, so let's fill it in. So I'm going to start with 7 squared equals 6 squared plus 10 squared minus 2 times 6 times 10 cosine, and I'm going to go ahead and put Q because I'm looking for angle Q. Alrighty, and then here it's just neat, careful with the arithmetic. Okay, and you're going to see this one in particular, you can make a mistake if you're not careful. So I'm going to work through all my squares and my multiplication in my first step. And you can, as you get better, go ahead, but be careful. 49 equals 36 plus 100 minus 2 times 6 is 12. 12 times 10 is 120. So minus 120 cosine Q. Now, major red flag or danger moment here is people love to subtract the 100 and the 120. Do not do that. Do not subtract 100 from 120 because this is not just 120. This is 120 times cosine Q. So this is kind of like 2x or 120x. You cannot subtract this 120. What you can do is you can either, and again, I'm just going to keep it simple. So I'm just going to move everything. We want us to get Q by itself. So we need to start moving everything over to the left. And so if I have a positive 36, I'm going to undo that by subtracting 36 here. And so then we'd rewrite this. And this is slow. You can get faster, but that'll cancel out. So then I get 13 equals 100 minus 120 cosine Q. I know you, Jeremy, and Cosmo, and some of you guys are just going to try to go really fast through this. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I need to subtract the 100. Again, do not subtract these two because this would be like 100 minus 120x. They're unlike terms, so don't subtract these. Big, major, tempting disaster and point of frustration. So no, instead, I'm going to do the opposite of positive 100. I'm going to subtract 100. Again, that cancels out. So now I'm going to get negative 87 equals negative 120 cosine Q. And so now I'm in a circumstance where this is basically like something equals 2x. Instead of multiplying by a negative 120, I'm going to now divide. See why I'm letting you use a calculator in this chapter? Divide by negative 120. Okay? So that cancels out, and we are left with negative 87. I really could make this positive, but I'll just leave the negatives. Negative 87 over negative 120 equals cosine Q. Okay? So one last step, and this goes back to, I think, 8.3, is we actually have to find angle Q. So how do I undo a cosine? What's the opposite or the inverse of a cosine? And that is correct. It is inverse cosine. So I need to take the inverse cosine of both of these, and then that will cancel out this, just like all the other canceling steps. Algebra is simply doing the opposite operation. Opposite of positive 36 is subtract. Opposite of adding 100 is subtracting. Opposite of multiplying by negative 120 is dividing. The opposite of cosine Q is inverse cosine in Q. So now we're left with this to put in our calculator. Inverse cosine, it's inverse, be careful, of, and I would just leave this as a fraction, negative 87 over negative 120 equals our beloved and much sought after angle Q. Okay, so then that's calculator time. Unless you have a computer for a brain. Okay, so here we go. So notice I'm on inverse now. Cosine, I'm going to go to inverse cosine, and I'm going to put negative 87 divided by negative 120. That's very important. You lose your negatives, it's going to cost you. Equals, and that looks like a good degree, 43.5. It says on this problem to round to the nearest whole degree, so that's going to be rounded to 44 degrees. So good old Q is approximately 44 degrees. Now we are working very slowly because we don't want to make mistakes, and this is new to you, and so you might be like, think that's an incredible amount of work. It is a little more, but I promise the more you work at it, especially by the time you get to Algebra 2 and beyond, or the end of this chapter, you can be very good and quick at it. And this problem will not feel like so much work after you do a few of them. Okay, everything's always hard at first when you're first learning it. Keep going. So 44 degrees. Praise the Lord. Okay, number 31. For 31, it says to please find angle X. Angle X. All right. Now, if we look at this one, now we can see we do have our much needed corresponding side and angle. So I have that. So if I have that relationship, I can then compare these up, and I can solve for angle X. So law of sines is simply the sine of one of the sides, angles over its side, and the sine over another angle and its corresponding side. So we can go ahead and plug that in. Start with the one you know. I know sine of 78 over its corresponding side, 3.9, equals, I don't know this angle, sine of x. Again, be careful that this is always your angles. If you're trying to find an angle, that's what goes up here. The sides are the bottom. And because I know side, 3.6. And so now we've set up a proportion of this angle on its side to this angle on its side. We know 3 of them. We're missing 1. So we can solve. How? Cross, multiply, and divide. I'll go slower though, but if you're rocking this, all you do is you say, oh, I'm going to cross, multiply, and divide by that. But we'll go a little slower. So cross multiply, 3.6 times sine 78 equals 3.9 times sine x. And we say cross multiply and divide because look what always happens. To get my sine x by itself, I need to go ahead and, instead of multiplying by 3.9, I'm going to divide by 3.9 both sides. Okay, so that cancels out. And so now I get 3.6 times sine 78 over 3.9 equals sine x. I'm going to run out of room, so I'm going to have to move over to here. But this is just a number. There's no variables here. I can put this in my calculator, and let's see what sine of x equals. You'll see that's not the end of the problem, but we're just about there. Okay, so 3.6 times, better go to regular sine of 78. I'm going to hit equals just to make sure that's calculated, divided by now my 3.9. there's a ugly, and you might think, oh, that's a terrible number. No, well, that's perfect because that's what sine of angles tend to become. So I'm going to take 4 of those digits, or if you have a nicer calculator, you can store this number. But I'm going to say, okay, so the sine of x, I'm moving kind of back sideways over here just for more space. The sine of x is equal to 0.9029. All right, and so just like this problem up here, where I had cosine of q equals, this is a decimally number. It was a fraction this time, but it's the same idea. I had to do the inverse of cosine to undo that. That's the same exact situation I am here. I need to, how do I undo sine of x? The opposite operation is inverse sine. So I need to take the inverse sine of both sides. The inverse sine, I'm going to write it out just to be very clear, of 0.9029 is going to tell me what angle x is. So let's go ahead and put that into our calculator. Again, a nicer calculator, I could do that right from that number, but I'm going to have to clear it. Inverse sine of 0.9029. We put that in there right? Yes, it is. Equals nearest whole degree, 65 degrees. 64.5. So that means x is equal to 65 degrees, which is what you'll see in the back of the book. That is correct. So x is 65 degrees. Okay, so 2 examples from your classwork. Nothing much trickier than this. Some of them much easier where you're just practicing using your calculator, like 17 through 25. But law of cosines, where you need to find the angle. Law of sines, where you need to find an angle. All right, please reach out if you need help. I would love to help you.